Okay, hi everybody. Let's talk a little bit about population genetics. Specifically, I would like to just very quickly go over ways to apply the Hardy-Weinberg equation to measure evolutionary change. This tends to be a difficult concept for some students, and I think that it really stems from math phobia because this stuff is pretty basic math. It does ask you to work with numbers and calculate square roots and things like that, but more importantly, it asks you to translate properties of a biological population into mathematical terms. So hopefully this will clear up some problems on that front. Before we go any further, I want you to take a look at these 6 terms and make sure that you understand what they mean. For some of you, this will be review, so I'm not going to go over it explicitly. But for others, you may not be familiar with these terms. So what I need you to do is, again, take a look, pause the video, and take some time to look these up and write down definitions. I have to use these terms when I'm explaining these concepts. Okay? All right, let's move on. First of all, some definitions and dissection of these equations. For a population, we're just going to define P as the frequency of the dominant allele and Q as the frequency of the recessive allele. And so if we assume there are only 2 alleles for that gene in a population, then it follows that P plus Q equals 1. In other words, if you think about frequency as kind of like percentages, frequencies are just a decimal version of a percent. They range from 0 to 1. If the frequency of the dominant allele in a population is, for example, 0.5, then the frequency of the recessive allele, the only other option, has to also be 0.5 because together they have to add up to 1. 0.5 plus 0.5 equals 1. Let's look at another example. The males in a population produce sperm with a recessive allele 80% of the time. How often do they produce sperm with the dominant allele, assuming the population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium? And we'll talk about conditions for which, or under which Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium holds in class. But for now, just trust me, this population's in equilibrium. If we look at this, what we're given, the recessive allele frequency, is Q, which equals 0.8. Okay? Now, since P plus Q equals 1, P must be 0.2 because 0.2 plus 0.8 equals 1. Hopefully this is pretty straightforward. Okay, so moving on. Now, if we have a population that has these dominant and recessive alleles, well, we can set up a Punnett square here. Okay, so you'll remember this from Bio 104 if you took it, but basically what I'm showing here is let's just imagine that the male options are in columns. A male can either produce a dominant allele, P, or a recessive allele, Q, and likewise the female can produce either a dominant allele, P, or a recessive allele, Q. And when these gametes, when the sperm combines with the egg, there are 3 different possibilities in the circumstance. 2 dominant alleles can meet, and they will meet at a frequency of p squared, because p times p equals p squared. 2 recessive alleles can meet, like both the male and the female donate recessive alleles. And that happens at a frequency of q squared, because q times q equals q squared. Now, the male might donate a dominant allele, whereas the female donates the recessive allele, and that happens at a frequency of p times q. And the opposite can happen too. The recessive allele can come from the male, and the dominant allele can come from the female, and that also happens at a frequency of p times q. Okay, so if you look at this, we can define these terms. P squared is the frequency of homozygous dominant genotypes in the population. 2pq, this 2 comes from the fact that there are 2 ways to get a heterozygote. 2pq equals the frequency of the heterozygous genotype, and q squared equals the frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype. And if you combine these 3 different options, we can get a Hardy-Weinberg equation for genotypic frequencies. P squared plus 2pq plus q squared has to equal 1. In other words, the frequency of homozygous dominant individuals plus the frequency of heterozygous individuals plus the frequency of homozygous recessive individuals has to add up to 1. Right? So these are the 2 important equations. P plus Q equals 1. This equation is for answering questions about allele frequencies. And then P squared plus 2pq plus Q squared equals 1 is for answering questions about genotypic and sometimes even phenotypic frequencies. So with that, I would like to, I'm going to switch over to a different computer program here. I would like to do a practice problem that helps you identify various terms in a real-world situation and gives you some strategies for solving these problems. Okay? All right, so here's the practice problem, and it has to do with sickle cell anemia, which you're probably familiar with. And you can read here, but basically, it's this problem is giving a little bit of background that normal heterozygous individuals have normal blood cells. These are homozygous dominant individuals, so that's what they mean by normal. Homozygous recessive individuals basically die of sickle cell anemia, but heterozygotes, okay, this disease is inherited via incomplete dominance, where the heterozygous individual has a different phenotype than both homozygotes. Heterozygotes have some sickling of red blood cells, but generally not enough to cause mortality. However, because of this condition, malaria cannot survive well within these partially defective red blood cells. And this is why you see sickle cell disease maintained in populations such as sub-Saharan African populations, where malaria is an important selective factor, okay, where malaria is endemic. Okay, so what this is giving us is it's saying is that 9% of an African population is born with a severe form of sickle cell anemia, and it's asking for these 4 things. The first one is the frequency of the recessive allele in the population. Okay, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. What I'd like to do is write down the equations that we have to work with. Okay, so the first one is, you'll recall, for calculating allele frequencies, and it says P plus Q equals 1. The frequency of the dominant allele plus the frequency of the recessive allele is equal to 1. The second equation is useful at calculating genotypic and phenotypic frequencies, and it says the frequency of the homozygous dominant genotype plus the frequency of the heterozygous genotype plus the frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype also has to equal to 1. So whenever you're doing a Hardy-Weinberg problem. Keep these two equations in mind. They're the only things that you really have to remember. The other thing to keep in mind is that you're always given something, and in this case, we are given that 9% of the population is homozygous recessive. In other words, 9% is equal to Q squared. Okay, and we're going to translate this into frequencies. Okay, Q squared, remember, is the frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype. That is what we're given. This first question is asking for the frequency of the recessive allele. So when you see allele, recessive allele, you should key in on this first equation. The recessive allele is notated by Q, so somehow from Q squared equals 0.09, we got to figure out Q, and it's basically just taking the square root of 0.09. And if you put that into your calculators, you'll find that the square root of 0.09 is 0.3. Okay, so already we're making progress here. The next problem, number 2, is asking for the frequency of the dominant allele. And at this point, we have enough information to calculate that relatively easy. What we're being asked for is P. Okay? And from this first equation, we can get it. If Q equals 0.3 and P plus Q equals 1, P must equal 0.7. Okay? The third question, what percentage of the population will be more resistant to malaria because they are heterozygous for the sickle cell gene? They're asking here for what amounts to 2pq. And this is just simple multiplication at this point. 2pq equals 2 times p, which is 0.7, times q, which is 0.3. And that equals, if you do the multiplication there, 0.42. In other words, 42% of this population should be heterozygous. And finally, number 4 is asking what percentage of the population will have the normal phenotype. Okay, so notice I didn't say genotype here, I said phenotype. But because of the way this disease is inherited, the homozygous dominant genotype is the only way to get the normal phenotype. So what I'm asking for here is P squared, and P squared just equals 0.7 squared, which equals 0.49. Okay, so hopefully you found this relatively straightforward. We will go over some additional examples in class. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on it, actually. But before that, I would like you to take the quiz for this week, and I would also, which has a couple Hardy-Weinberg questions on it, and I would also like you to jot down any particular questions that you might have about this and be ready to share them in class. Until then, have fun, and I'll see you soon.